everybody, this is the BG, and I'm back again to narrate a video about one of my favorite topics, knife sharpening. I am sorry I've been away for the entire year. I've been putting together a cabinet shop at our house, and maybe sometime in the future we'll have a channel about cabinet making or woodworking. But today, this is something my friends keep asking me to do, is about knife sharpening, because I'll actually sharpen my friends' knives from time to time throughout the year. And this way I can just pawn it off and say, watch the video and buy some stones. This is something that I learned a long time ago. My dad was a cabinet maker, and I grew up with him explaining a lot of these things. But then when I was 18, I started working in a professional shop. I took out my pocket knife. I was very proud. We were talking about knives, and I took out mine, and I was showing off the edge to one of the master joiners. And he looked at it, and he said, "You don't know how to sharpen knives." I said, "What are you talking about? My dad taught me when I was a kid, an oil stone." He's like, "You don't use oil stones, you use water stone." Never heard about using a whetstone before. He brought me over, and it was one of the most life-changing experiences I've ever had. The guy's name was Earl Richards. He was an absolute amazing woodworker to watch. He could do everything by hand. He was very old school. Most of the work he was doing was, dovetail joinery for drawers and things like that, but everything he did was by hand. And so he always had a set of whetstones set up on this little stand, by his bench. And so he walked me over and explained the process of actually using a water stone for sharpening these things. Now, I still use oil stones for certain applications. When I'm using router bits that are dull, I will sharpen those with it's actually oil and a diamond stone. But for kitchen gear, I always use water stones. And so the process I'm going to show you today is a 4-stone method. I have the heaviest grit, which is a 220. It's the roughest one. And then stones get smoother as their grit number goes up. So I'll start with a 220 grit. That's about as low as I'd ever want to go. It does a lot of removal of the metal very quickly. So if you go to a lower number than this, you're going to be removing a lot of meat from the knife very quickly. And so 220, 250 is a good starting point. And then after that, I'll have a 1,000 grit stone as a medium, and then 4,000 grit stone, and then finish with an 8,000 grit stone. Now, somewhere in the 8,000, 10,000 grit is where you want to finish out at. For me, the way that these stones came along, they're double-sided, so you have a 220, 1,000, and then a 4,000, 8,000 grit stone. They just make a great set for me. Today what we're going to go over is, actually how to use these stones. In an earlier video, when we were doing cutting up a chicken, the first thing I do is you see me honing my knife. And, that's just to make sure that I have a good straight edge to start with that day, because the sharper the knife, the easier it is to use. And the more often that you hone the knife, the longer you can go between sharpening sessions. I usually sharpen my knives about once a year, and I use them a lot. I mean, we do a lot of cooking, and I'm pretty hard on them. If you're just somebody who is not cooking that often, you can go years between sharpening if you hone it occasionally. First step is to soak your stones. That's just a plastic tub that I have that's deep enough to submerge these. You want to have something, you can put them in a Ziploc bag, it doesn't matter. Just anything you can do to get these stones fully submerged in water, and you need them submerged for 20 to 30 minutes. Figure out what knives you want to get sharpened, lay those out, and then after the stone's been soaked, I lay down a dish rag on the center of a double bowl sink, and then I'll put the stone with the 220 grit edge facing up. And so we'll start there. Now, I like doing it in the sink because I can actually leave the faucet running, and I can just splash water on when I need to. There are also holders that you can spread across either like a tub or across the basin of a sink that hold them up and keep them secure. The point is you want to have these things where the stones are staying secure and not moving around that much. So for me, the dish rag and putting it on the sink, it works out well. The 220 grit is meant to reestablish the edge geometry of the blade. When you start out, you start looking at the edge of the blade very closely, and you can see there's dings and whatnot in it. So the first step is to actually remove all the dings and get the edge straightened back up again. So for the 220 grit, that's what I'm using for that. What you can see, and this is very important from what my dad taught me to what Earl taught me, My dad would swirl a knife on a stone, on the oil stone, and the problem with that is that you're like creating this wavy edge all the way across the knife. What you want is a smooth sliding motion, and that sliding motion is not parallel to the blade. It's actually at like a 45 degrees to the blade. So what you can see for me, what I'm doing is I'm holding that knife up at an angle, and I use, you know, like about a 17-degree angle. You get used to it just through practice. There are holders that you can buy that actually hold the blade at a certain angle that you can rub against the stone until you get proficient at it. It doesn't really matter as you're practicing if you set the angle at 15 degrees or 17 degrees or 20 degrees or even more than that. It's just something to get practice on, and you'll be able to see when you look at the second bevel. That's how I can tell what angle I'm at. I see how big the second bevel is. I can see if I'm coming in at too low of an angle or too high of an angle. Starting with this, you know, I'm basically moving the knife at a 45 degrees while sliding it. You are moving the blade up and down the stone, but also sliding it at an angle. What this is doing is it's removing the metal equally on the push stroke and the pull stroke. If you only go in one direction on the stone, like if I'm only pulling it or only pushing it, what happens is you're going to form a burr on the other side of the knife, and you're trying to eliminate that. You're trying to keep a symmetrical removal of metal on both sides of the blade. And so I start with the 220, go back and forth. You know, you can count off 5 passes or 10 passes per side, flip it around, do the other side. But, you know, start with the 220 and then clean off the knife. What's very important here is that when you go to the next stone, every bit of grit of the previous stone needs to be removed. Because if a particle of the 220 grit stone is on the 1000 grit stone, you'll actually feel it. It's like, you know, when you get a rock in your shoe when you're walking. So everything needs to be clean. Everything needs to be rinsed off. The knife needs to be wiped off, rinsed off, and then flipped over to the next side. What this is a macro shot of the 220 grit stone. And so you can see it looks super ragged, you know, at high magnification. You can actually see the bits of the towel, the blue towel coming off on the edge of the knife because it's rough. But what I'm looking for in this stage is, do I have an equal second bevel on both sides, the left and the right side of the blade? You know, if not, then I need to hit that side a little stronger to make sure that my bevel's equal on both sides. If I'm happy with the, in this case, I'm happy with what the edge looks like, I'm going to move on to the 1000 grit stone and then do the same thing. Keep going until you see that the roughness, you'll actually be able to hear the difference in the stone. The 220 grit stone has a very rough, coarse sound to it. I moved to the 1000 grit stone. It starts getting a little bit quieter, gets a little smoother on it. What you're trying to do here is just get a good muscle memory on the movement of this. You know, when I'm doing this, I've done hundreds of blade sharpenings in my life. And, you know, this muscle memory is kind of permanent at this point. It just takes practice to do it. So, and you're also hearing for it too. You know, as you practice this more, you can tell if the stone is too dry, if it's too wet. You know, you want to have just enough water to form kind of a skim on top of it. And actually, when you start removing the metal of the knife, it mixes with the stone powder and it forms something called the slurry. That's the gray pool that you see there. That's actually very important for the knife sharpening. What I'm doing is I'll push and pull the blade at an angle while sliding it back and forth 5 to 10 times per side, and just keep going back and forth with it, and then making sure that I'm getting an even second bevel across the whole thing. I'm looking for how wet the stone is. If it's dry, I'll splash a little bit more water on it. If it's too wet, I'll just let it run out. I'll also swirl that slurry occasionally to make sure that it's uniform across the stone. Next step then is to move on to the 4000 grit stone. Now in this case I'm going to show the macro shot too of after the 1000 grit stone. You can see that my edge quality is getting better and things getting smoother. There's less of the blue towel on the edge of the knife. One thing you'll notice, you know, when you see my hand actually rubbing across the blade is be very, 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 very careful when you're, you know, wiping the water on the blade. I know that I'm always going to be moving away from the knife edge and not towards it. That's the most important rule. Even though it looks like I am moving parallel along that blade, I am not. I'm very slightly moving outward from the blade so I don't cut myself. And you can hear the difference actually on the 4000 grit stone. I mean, it gets much quieter at this point, and it gets very smooth. And the slurry gets, it actually forms faster, and you get like, you can see it on the stone easier because it's a lighter colored stone. But what you're doing here is you keep polishing the edge quality of the stone up. And so now when I show the macro shot of after the 4000 grit stone, now the edge is getting even better. And if you actually look at it, you can see that it gets more to be like a mirror-like quality. So finish up the 4000 grit doing the same thing, just keep moving it back and forth until it feels smooth, feels fluid, and you can actually tell if the edge is getting better on it. When you just hold it up to a light, look, sight it down the edge and just look at the edge quality, it should start looking like a mirror at this point. You're going to get into an argument about edge retention. The sharper that you make a knife, the faster it will actually dull itself, because the finer the edge you make, the more delicate and fine that edge is, the faster it roll over. And so for me, there's a happy medium between edge quality and retention that you're going to be looking for. And the way that he taught me on checking to see how far you should go is, I see a lot of times on knife sharpening videos where the guys will like shave with it afterwards when they're done their arm. That is unnecessary. If the edge is actually sharp enough to shave with, it's not going to be good for kitchen uses. The reason that it's fine for, if I had a straight blade I was using for shaving, that thing, you are actually working the edge every day. You're going to be lapping it with a leather strop every day, or some kind of strop, and so you have a very high maintenance on that edge every day. Where a kitchen knife, people aren't running those on stones or stropping them every day. The best thing you can actually do is using a honing rod. I was watching another video where it was a guy named Wranglestar, his popular YouTuber, and he was going over the tools that he did not like, the top 10 worst tools that he had, and it really annoyed me. But he said he hated the the honing rod that he had, and I'm like, that's not used for sharpening. A honing rod is used for honing a knife. Honing a knife means you're just moving the metal around. You're straightening the wire edge back up. When you sharpen a stone, you're physically removing metal. And so those are two very different things. And when I heard him say that, I just kind of lost respect for his understanding of actually all things knives at that point, because it's a very common thing for people that are good at knives to know what that is. Next step would be rinsing off the knife completely, and then going on to the 8000 grit stone. Now at this point, I mean, it basically feels almost like leather when you rub this knife against 8000 grit stone. I mean, that's what you're approaching, is a very, very high grit. And so flip it over, do the same thing. I'm rubbing the knife, same exact pattern on all these stones. It's always a sliding motion at a slight angle. It's about a 45 degree. When you look at these macro shots, you can tell, you can actually see the grit of the stones in it, is about a 45 degree to that. So every time that I'm moving around, I'm always sliding and then pushing or pulling at the same time, and that way the angle of attack of the knife against the stone is at about a 45 degrees, sliding along. But I finished with the 8000 grit stone. This is what a macro shot of after that finishes. I mean, it is basically a mirror polish. It was actually really hard for me to even show this shot, because with all the lighting around it and the fact that the edge quality is getting better, the lighting gets a lot harder to do. So I actually had to do a second shot. This is what this one is. It's actually sighting along the blade instead of just like right at it. And you can see that the edge quality of the second bevel is basically the same as the body of the knife, the first bevel of the knife. And that's what you're going for. Once you get to that mirror polish, this is as good as you're going to get. And actually the test to do, regardless of all the other things that are possible for testing a knife, like cutting on a piece of paper, or I've seen some professional knife sharpeners where they have like they use a scale and then they have something they slice through, and you can basically figure out the force that it takes to slice through something is, you know, how sharp a knife is. Those are fine for like analytical testing, but for what needs to happen inside of a kitchen or a wood shop is one test. You simply just hold your thumbnail at a 45 degrees like I'm showing, and then put the knife edge on your thumbnail. If it doesn't fall off, it's sharp enough. So basically, your thumbnail, you know, it's very, very slightly cutting into your thumbnail enough just to let it sit there. If it's not sharp enough, if you shake your thumb at all, it'll just slide right off. And so right now I'm showing the shot of what a dull knife would do. Is you can see how now it's sliding off of my thumb. But that's the only test. It's not shaving your arm. It's not testing on these other things. You don't need to do any of that. It's simply just set it on your thumbnail and see if it moves off. Now, please, sweet Lord, be careful when you're doing this, because I don't want you to cut your thumb. But you know, if you're just holding it near the, you know, the table or a cutting board or something like that, you don't need to worry about hurting yourself. But that's it. That's sharpening a knife. The last thing I'm doing here is getting the stones flat again. So this is not something that needs to be done every single time. This, you know, can be done every 3 or 4 times. But as you are using the knife and sharpening on the stone, you're actually going to be digging out a little dish in the stone, because the stone is slowly removing itself as you're sharpening. That green block that has the angle marks, or the angle channels in it, is the same grit as the 220 stone. So unfortunately I can't use it on the 220 grit stone, but anything higher than that I can. So what I'm doing is I'm just rubbing the 2 stones together in kind of a swirling pattern. And if you rinse off the stone and then go back to the sharpening stone again, like what you're seeing there is in the middle of the stone, it's a little lower because the slurry isn't going away, but it's, you know, it went back to the stone color outside of the stone. So you just have to keep rubbing until you know that you're level again. And I just go through all the stones like that. I'll start with the 800 or the 1000 grit, and then go into the 4000 and 8000 grit to get them level again. But that's it. It's you know, it's simple to watch, it's simple to do, it just takes a tremendous amount of practice. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years now, and I feel very comfortable doing it, but it's going to take a while for everybody to get comfortable doing it. But it is certainly better than these god-awful pole stroke, I don't even know what they're called, types of knife sharpeners, where they're just, you drag a knife through like this little holder. Those just are torture for knives. Don't ever use those. They're disgusting. Lord, no, don't use those, because you're effectively making a serrated knife at a microscopic level with those things. They might seem like they're sharp, but they're not sharp. It's disgusting. You know, you learn this, you'll actually get an edge that stays for longer. And it's actually, you can feel the difference when you're cutting, especially something like a tomato. But that's it. That's all I got. But this is the BG, keeping it sharp and keeping it square. Have a good weekend.
Thanks for watching today. Hope he didn't freak you out with that thumb thing. Let us know what you think if you try this method out by commenting on this video. You are gonna try this, right? Right, Kyle? Kyle? No? That's okay. Keep watching, Kyle. Until next time, friends, thanks for joining us on our final freezer.
No, I didn't make any mistakes.
Oh. Are you sure?
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Okay. Excuse me.
In fact.
Ooh. Nice, very classy.